We're continuing on chapter 11 today, and if you remember right, this is all about adolescence, which is, pretty interesting stuff here. Now, one of the things we were talking about last time was the role of physical attractiveness, which really impacts your development, how you think of yourself, your self-concept, and we kind of implied that physical attractiveness was a very biological thing. And while that is necessarily true, a lot of the choices that we make have a huge impact on physical attractiveness. So, and this is where kind of the self-esteem comes in and the choices that you make. You can just take a few different things and really change how you look and during this kind of pivotal time, change how you think about yourself. So I'm going to give you an example here of kind of a before and after picture of myself because I can use that as an example. Okay, this is me a few years ago. That is an artificial prosthetic arm I was making for a costume, but as you can see, I had glasses. I just kind of let myself go. I was about 50 pounds overweight at the time, which is why I needed the prosthetics. And this is me a couple of years afterwards. I got LASIK surgery, did something with my hair, actually trimmed up my wardrobe a little bit, and needless to say, it made an absolutely enormous difference on physical appearance. Now, as you can see, the before and the after picture were pretty drastically different. I lost about 50 pounds. I cut my hair. I gave myself a haircut. It completely changed all the clothes that I wore. I just hadn't been paying attention to what I was wearing in any way whatsoever, and that was actually very distracting. It's the little things like that that really make a absolutely huge difference, and it does the same thing with anybody of any age. Um, and it's all just a matter of motivation. So if you feel particularly motivated, which adolescence is a great time for motivating individuals, if you feel particularly motivated by something, then you can go ahead and change it. The problem is that most people really misunderstand motivation. So they will say that okay, stereotype, for example, that overweight people in this country, they feel depressed because they're overweight, and then so they're thinking about their overweightness, and then they become depressed, and then they eat, and then of course they're more overweight, and it's kind of this vicious cycle. But a lot of it is the same motivation that the rest of us have. I had mentioned the third party effect at one point, where you kind of assume that everybody else has different motivations than you do, and this is very much the same. The motivations people have for not improving their life, and this includes adolescence as it does with everything else, is usually that they're not thinking about it. Not that they're thinking about it so much that it discourages them. I didn't have that before picture where I was just basically letting myself go because I was depressed. I was doing it because I wasn't thinking about how I looked. And what motivated me to change how I looked was the fact that I was dating again, and I saw a couple of kind of dumpy looking people, and I wasn't interested in them because I'm like, I want somebody that has a little bit more self-respect than that. And then I looked at myself, and I'm like, okay, so apparently I wouldn't date myself. And then I just made myself, and it's been important to me ever since because I started thinking about it. Um, and this is the same motivation that adolescents have. Now, as far as cognitive changes go, this is where Piaget would start referring to adolescence as being in the formal operational stage. This is where they're going to start to get really good at abstract thinking. They can start to understand things like religion or hypotheticals at this point. This is the most highly criticized part of Piaget's stages of development. The rest he nailed down pretty well. Formal operational, not quite so much. I'd probably mention that they had done studies with freshmen in college and found that 75% of them could not understand a hypothetical situation. So there's a lot of problems with the formal operational stage. There are certainly types of logical processes that people of this age can start to do. And it really is miraculous, the changes in cognitive development that they can do. It's just leaps and bounds over what it was before. But at the same time, they're still very, very limited. And it's not actually going to be until uh, early adulthood, say between the ages of 20 and 25, before people are really going to start to solidify into exactly all that they can do cognitively. Teenagers are still larvae. mentally. Physically, they're grown, but mentally not so much. And we'll get into some of the physical changes as well later on. Um, this is actually I'll continue to talk about the physical stages here. This is some physical changes that are more known for not happening during adolescence is the masculinization. Uh, Teenagers are still relatively androgynous. This is has started to become a bit of a problem with transgender individuals because we're much more acceptable for say men that want to turn into women later on in life, and this is a time during adolescence when they can still do that and still actually look like a female because they're androgynous, and if they start taking the medication they'll start to develop some female features. But if they wait until they're around 20 to 25, then they'll get really masculinized. Their face will change, their body will change. They'll get, especially the face, the nose, the cheekbones, start to get really masculinized between about the ages of 20 and 25. And but at the same time, we're telling them that okay, say you're confused, you have some gender confusion here. Don't make this choice now. Put it off until you're an adult. Actually not that good of advice to have because you're basically damning them to one of two bad choices. Either they're going to regret their decision and feel that they've wasted their entire adolescence hoping to be a gender that they eventually change their mind to, or you have them wait and then they eventually change their gender, and now they'll never look like who they want to be. So having them wait is actually guaranteed to be a bad idea, but at the same time, you don't want them to make choices too early either. So it's kind of a rough position for people in transgender, just because those physical changes haven't quite happened yet. Now, getting into the cognitive aspects of change. And not necessarily just Piaget, but the different cognitive processes that they have. Most of them are involved in the social and the emotional aspects, which we'll get into tomorrow and the next day. But there are some cognitive aspects that are very important. They go over two in the book, and they don't actually really hint as to what this leads to. Most likely because they're not trying to get into abnormal psych. The first thing they go over is something called the imaginary audience. And this is the fact that teenagers have a tendency, and it's not just teenagers, there are other people as well, have this feeling that people are watching them. It's almost like teenagers get this feeling as that they are the main character in a television show. And even the concept that they're a side character is very insulting for them. But they kind of believe that people are watching them, but what they do is memorable and to be remembered and important to people other than themselves. And so they call this the imaginary audience. The other thing is called a personal fable. And this is also very related to the imaginary audience where, again, it's like you're part of this story and you're the center of it. And they're kind of ignoring the fact that all the other teenagers think the same thing. And it's one of the things that makes teenagers kind of laughable to adults. And we'll get into this a little bit more socially, but I'll mention it now because it's really relevant. To those of you who are in your teenage years or very close to it, you may not know what I'm saying, but those of you who are in the adult years definitely know. Teenagers are kind of funny to adults because they have this inflated sense of self-importance, and they really, really think that they're cool. They think that they have this corner on the market of knowing what fun is, and yet everything that they do for fun looks really lame to adults. Drinking until you fall down is not fun. Doing drugs is something for teenagers. Adults don't really do this all that much. Listening to music. How many teenagers base their personality on the music they listen to while completely ignoring the fact that once they actually grow up, all the adults don't do this anymore. This is a childish thing to do. It's fine to enjoy music, but to define yourself on I listen to thrash metal is just, it's immature and very sophomoric. But they don't see that. because they're also starting to get a sense of ethnocentrism, and that is the belief that what they have is normal, and the rest of the world is basically compared to them. And we do this. Ethnocentrism is usually referred to a cultural belief such as this. Like, we believe America is normal, and anybody outside of America is abnormal based on how far away they are from us. But they think their personality is like this. So they will naturally think that everybody thinks that music is like a center part of their life. Instead of just something that they enjoy, just another art form that they find beautiful and that enriches their life, like these same teenagers will later on. At the same time, again, this is a little bit more culturally. Even though they think that the world centers around themselves, um, they have no idea what to look for, so everything they get is from adults. The fads they get are from adults, the fashions they get are from adults, how they dress, how they talk, how they walk. These are all things they see adults do it, they think it's cool, but at the same time they say adults are lame. Even though all the movie stars are trying to copy and all these things, they're all adults. But they don't see that because they're only thinking from their own perspective. It's almost like they're going back to that 5-year-old egocentric perspective. Which is interesting in a cognitive level. Now, this imaginary audience and the personal fable lead to one thing that they don't talk about at all in the book, which is a crying shame, and that is narcissism. Now, narcissistic personality disorder is something that most teenagers would score very high on, and but it's not necessarily what people think it is. Yes, narcissism is named after the ancient Greek Narcissus, who was very attractive and saw his reflection in a pool and fell in love with himself immediately and actually drowned trying to embrace himself. Because he was just so in love with himself. And yes, narcissism does have this kind of base of self-love. But if you actually look up narcissistic personality disorder, you'll see that the symptoms of narcissistic personality disorder are very, very specific. And you see it misused all the time. And clinicians, by the way, very common to misuse narcissism. Because narcissism has a basis in basically being really into yourself, in being egocentric, self-centered, doesn't necessarily mean that's how it's shown. Thinking that you're wonderful does not make you narcissistic. Thinking that you're the best person in the world does not make you narcissistic. It's the symptoms that make you narcissistic. And thinking that everybody is watching you is one of these symptoms. Thinking that you are more important than other people is one of the symptoms. One of the I had a student describe to me a problem that he was having, and he was telling me that he felt a great deal of personal importance. He always felt that other people were watching him, and even just walking down the street, he felt that all the people in cars were watching him, so he had to kind of try to look as important as he could all the time because of all these eyes all over him. Some people would call this a delusion of paranoia, which I suppose it is. Most personality disorders are going to have delusionary beliefs. But at the same time, narcissistic people have delusions of power. They think that very common when you have narcissism, you believe that you have some ability that other people don't have. Maybe you'll think you'll have psychic abilities, or you can read people better than others. You are basically special. You are more than other people. And this is one of the things that really turns it from just an odd, annoying personality to an actual disorder. And this is something that most teenagers have. Most teenagers have a very unrealistic sense of their own abilities because of this kind of cognitive structure and trying to deal with both the imaginary audience and the personal fable. Now, like I said, part of this, whether it's the narcissism or anything, is that teenagers have a tendency to believe that they're special and unique. I swear, if I had a nickel for every teenager that said, "I'm weird and I'm proud of it," I would have a whole pocket full of nickels. Not really that much money, but still. Most teenagers think that they're unique and special, and we encourage this. And clinically, you shouldn't. You should not encourage this belief that they're unique and special, because it's not healthy to have unrealistic delusions. And most humans, most adults, are not unique and special. The individual differences that we have between the different people are insignificant. If everybody was unique and special, psychology would cease to exist as a science, because there wouldn't be enough similarity between people to even have a statistic on it. Fortunately, most of the similarities people have are insignificant, just like the differences between a snowflake. Yes, every snowflake is unique, but if you look up at the sky, what do you see? You see a bunch of snow. They're all the same for all intents and purposes. Even if you were to see a blue snowflake fall down, that is one difference. It is still the same as all the rest of the snowflakes, even if that particular difference is more salient. The one exception to this is a group of individuals called eccentrics, and there's a fabulous book by Dr. David Weeks called Eccentrics. It's a great read. I would highly recommend it to everybody. The book is fully called Eccentrics, A Study of Sanity and Strangeness. And the reason for that is because eccentrics, truly unique individuals, they all kind of have something, and they all have these things in common, and they are the truly unique among us. And eccentrics are about 1 in 10,000. They have a tendency to get celebrity status. Michael Jackson was a very famous eccentric. And these are individuals that know social conventions. You know, they know what's normal and what isn't. But it honestly never occurs to them that these social conventions apply to them too. So they will have a tendency to do unusual things. They're not, Michael Jackson did not do a bunch of plastic surgery to try to shock people. Other people's opinions never even came to mind while he was doing it. Maybe he would try to, calculate the drawbacks of it, whether or not it would affect his career, that sort of thing. But whether it was normal never really occurred to him, because that just wasn't the sort of person that he was. He was an eccentric. Now, most teenagers seem to think that they're eccentrics. They're not. And again, to an adult, we all see these people the same. You see one kid with his pants halfway down his ankles, and he just looks stupid. There's nothing eccentric about that. It's very conforming. So I will give you a list here of some of the traits that eccentrics have. And you'll see that some of these kind of resemble teenagers, but only how they think of themselves, not really what they do. The first trait of eccentrics is that they have a non-conforming attitude. Like I said, they don't think like other people, and they don't try to follow the crowd. This is how teenagers think they are, but they're not. Teenagers are incredibly conforming individuals. Eccentrics have a tendency to be extremely idealistic. They kind of follow their heart, and because they're not following social conventions, so all they have is their own internal compass to guide themselves by. Again, teenagers have a tendency to think they're very idealistic, when in reality they have a tendency to follow ideals that other people have told them, making them a lot more conforming than they ever want to admit. And so their ideals have a tendency to be what they've been told is idealistic. And this is an age where they really try to stick to ideals that they've been told. Maybe they'll try to get very involved in politics. And I'm not just talking about Democrat or Republican here, although, by all means, you start to get these affiliations here as well. But maybe someone will get really into recycling, or really into saving the planet, or climate change, or something like this. And these are the ideals, but they're ideals that have generally been fed to these people. Maybe they'll get really into religion, and they'll start preaching about God all the time. Eccentrics have another feature is intense curiosity. This is something that is actually starting to dwindle in the adolescents, because they've had intense curiosity throughout their entire life, but at this point they're trying to firm up who they are as a person. So their curiosity is actually starting to go away, although again they don't see this. Eccentrics have a tendency to get what's referred to as happily obsessed, with certain hobby horses, usually several. Um, One eccentric that I know builds bicycles. He has, oh, probably a couple hundred of them. Um, some very unusual. He's a guy in Boston, for example, and he rides, I swear, it's like a 7 foot tall bicycle. It has a telescopic disco ball on the front with lights going up to it, and, a motor. He can turn it on, and the thing goes to like 12, 15 feet. And, and it spins, and the lights are there, and he's got the music, and this is just all on his bicycle, just the one he likes to ride the most. Um, so he does this a lot, and then he started welding art um, and getting involved with a couple of charities, and it's just uh, and this is how eccentrics work, and teenagers kind of think that they do this too. Like I said, they get very obsessed with music, um, but they're not really thinking of it in any in-depth way. They feel deep thinking about it, but really they're just kind of shallowly listening to the music that's fed to them, perhaps that their peers do. Um, there's very few of them actually, creating music with any semblance of originality, anything like that. Again, they're very, very conforming individuals for the most part. Um, Eccentrics typically are highly intelligent, and of course, teenagers are, varied. However, I've probably mentioned that there are several aspects of ourselves that we really have no gauge on whatsoever. And intelligence is one of them. I had mentioned self-awareness is something we have no gauge on. We don't know how self-aware that we are. We have no way of knowing. We also really don't know how intelligent that we are. Most people think that they're above average intelligence. Even people who are below average intelligence typically think that they're above average or average. Um, um, Eccentrics have a tendency to be opinionated and outspoken. This is actually something that teenagers do have as well. Um, Eccentrics have a tendency to have unusual living or eating habits. Maybe they'll live in a cave or eat very specific foods. Um, they'll have a tendency to dress very unusually. Um, I, for example, wear lab coats whenever I go out. I make my own ties. I carry a metal briefcase. I ride a 5 foot tall Flaming Horns bicycle with a tractor trailer air horn on it. This is the sort of thing that an eccentric would do. And but the teenager, in their quest for nonconformity, kind of the ironic quest for nonconformity, typically considers that they have unusual eating or living habits, but it's usually just based on rebellion, and rebellion is a sort of conformity. And it's something that they really buy into at this point. They're basically rebelling against their parents in a very formulaic fashion. It's a recipe for being a teenager, and so they typically try to do something different by following their peers. On the other hand, their peers are just doing what other adults have told them is cool, whether it was in movies or songs or whatever. Um, Now, one of the things that since teenagers have this kind of bad self-awareness of how conforming that they are, while trying to be non-conforming, and it's all just a struggle for their own identity, they have a tendency to have a heightened sense of ethnocentrism. And like I said, that's where you think your culture is the culture, and everything else is compared to that. Uh, so whatever they're in, whatever environment they're in, they will assume that other environments are very similar. So, for example, if you talk to somebody in high school, they will probably assume that college is going to be relatively similar to high school. Um, when in fact you go to a big college, I know this is an online course, so you could necessarily be from anywhere. But if you go to a big college like UConn or SUNY Albany or any of the big colleges like that, it is drastically different from high school in pretty much all respects. For one thing, there are no popular kids. in college. There can't be popular kids in college. There are 15,000 people on campus. If you know 200, you still don't know anybody. If you know 200 people in high school, if you had 200 really close friends in high school, you would be amazingly popular because there's like a fourth of your student body, even on a very large high school. But you still don't know anybody in college, even if you know 200. So you can't really have popular people. You also really can't have cliques. You can't have this in group where you are here and then you have the other groups and it's kind of us against them. You just have a bunch of people in a much more mature and sophisticated fashion. Um, and People in high school can't really understand this. And ethnocentrism, by the way, will follow people for the rest of their life. I remember the first time I went to the South, I was at a research institute in North Carolina, and I was staying in a boarding house. In the boarding house, other than the two of us that are research students, were all black people. And I hadn't met black people before because I was born and inbred in Maine, where there just weren't any black people to talk to. So I was talking to them about various things about racism and whatnot, just because I found it fascinating to learn from people that knew a heck of a lot more about it than I did. And I was mentioning to one guy that there wasn't really racism in Maine because there wasn't anybody to be racist to. And he's like, no. He's like, I don't buy it. If you and I walk down the street next to each other, everybody there would think, oh, there's the white guy with the black guy. And he could not imagine that it wouldn't be the case. He could not imagine that the reality, and flat out wouldn't believe that the reality was we would walk down the street and they would think, neat, a black guy, because they had never seen one before. At least in person. And that's about as racist as they would have gotten, is neat, a black guy. So people will have a tendency to think that their norm is norm for everything else. They'll assume that other people will, have music live in, be part of who they are as a person, and not just as and they'll think that other people don't think that makes them shallow. When an adult will look at it and goes, okay, you need to, stop being so shallow. Nobody else wants to. I use music as an example because it's very salient in teenagers. A lot of teenagers do this, so much so that you'll have a teenager or anybody in adolescence drive down the street and have their music really, really loud because they will naturally assume that other people will want to hear their music. And as an adult, you will know nobody wants to hear your music. It is just selfish and kind of mean to want everybody else to hear your music. If they wanted to hear your music, they would play that music themselves. They do know how to turn on an MP3 player. You're not gifting anybody. You're cursing people by having them listen to your music, and this is just part of the egocentrism and self-centeredness, narcissism, really, by thinking that they have this special power to know what the best music is that you have in adolescence. And as we'll get into the social aspect, sometimes in our culture we're kind of expanding adolescence into much longer stages of life. It's not just teenagers anymore, where we have 20-year-olds, 26-year-olds sometimes still living in this adolescent fantasy where other people want to listen to their music, and they define themselves in very shallow terms and have this narcissistic personal fable that they're trying to live out before they actually move on to adulthood, which they're doing later and later stages. So next time we'll get into the social and emotional aspects, always fascinating, especially with adolescents.